Okay, finally, to just complicate this issue of states' rights a little bit more, the term states' rights, although we've used it and your textbook uses it in a very practical way to talk about what issues states should be able to decide for themselves, the term states' rights is actually very politically loaded, and it has a very complicated history with discrimination and racism. So I'll explain. When Southern states were fighting Washington, D.C., were fighting the national government over issues of discrimination and segregation, when the federal government was trying to force Southern states to enact anti-discrimination laws and apply the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, etc., in the 60s and beyond, one of the arguments that Southern states used to resist these efforts and continue with segregation and other forms of discrimination was the issue of states' rights. And the reason they use this term is because increasingly, from the 60s on, from the 1950s on, to openly advocate for racism and segregation was increasingly a non-starter for much of the country. And so states that wanted to continue with discriminatory policies had to find another way to frame it that politically might get more traction. So rather than say, we want to have segregation, we want to have a continuation of, racist discriminatory policy, Southern states would say, hey, under the Constitution, we have state rights and we're allowed to make our own decisions. And when the federal government comes in and forces us to change things that we like, or that at least some of us like, that is undemocratic, because we should have the freedom to make this policy. At the end of this second series of PowerPoint slides, I have a couple videos that illustrate how rhetorically states' rights have been used to uphold segregation and other forms of discrimination. One of them is George Wallace's inaugural speech. George Wallace was elected in 1963 to be the governor of Alabama. And in his inaugural address, he defends segregation and Jim Crow laws by arguing for states' rights, saying, we will resist the efforts of the federal government to take away our freedom. What fewer people are aware of, because this is a very famous speech, is that in 1980, when he was running for president, Ronald Reagan traveled to the Neshoba County Fair, which is near Philadelphia, Mississippi. And he gave a speech about states' rights. And he said, if I'm elected president, my administration will, back off the imposition of national policies on states and will give states more freedom. And I believe in states' rights. The fact that Reagan went to Mississippi and a town that was only 7 miles away from the place where 3 civil rights workers, 3 young men, were murdered by the Klan when they were trying to register voters is very significant. So some people will, when they talk about states' rights, will say the term states' rights is a dog whistle for racist policies. It's something that's coded, right? I mean, a dog whistle is a whistle that we can't hear, but dogs can hear. So when we say something is a dog whistle, it means it's like a secret code that some people will get the reference and some people won't. So when you go to a place like Mississippi and you talk about states' rights, that is loaded. And what they're not talking about is these practical things that, we've been discussing, the pros and cons of state control. They're talking in code about discrimination and allowing states the freedom to continue to discriminate. So these last videos are clips where Southern politicians, Strom Thurmond, who was a senator for a long time, many decades, from South Carolina, and George Wallace, who was governor of Alabama, are using the term states' rights in a very different way than we've been using it here. And it's important to recognize how sometimes when you hear that term, it is code for something very different than the practical pros and cons that we've been discussing here.